So tracking and trailing wildlife is something that's rarely talked about in hunting circles today. And if you do hear it talked about, it's usually referred to as blood trailing. And unfortunately, that's kind of what it's boiled down to for a lot of hunters, is just looking for blood or other obvious sign from the animal. And there is a tremendous amount of sign that animals leave when they move through the woods that you can key in on to help you find that animal after a shot. Now I'm going to take a few minutes just to talk about a few of the very basic things. This is not going to be a comprehensive tracking and trailing video. I just want to mention a couple of things to get you to thinking about some of the other things that you can be looking for when you're on the trail. So one of the things that is extremely helpful to take into consideration when you're trying to find an animal is the landscape, how things are put together. Because after that initial shock, that 3 or 4 or 5 seconds when an animal is out of his mind, he's busting through brush, and there's no telling which direction he's going to go, he's going to settle into a fairly predictable movement pattern. Now, for the most part, animals are lazy. They're not just going to go busting through the brush or straight up a hill just for the heck of it. They're going to take the path of least resistance, and that is what allows us to look at the landscape features and ask ourselves, okay, if I'm in this animal's shoes and I'm looking at this landscape and I have these options, which direction am I going to go? Oftentimes, the paths that are obvious to us are the paths that that animal will have taken. So if you take where I'm standing right now as kind of an extreme example, I've got a cliff face over here, I've got a nice grassy slope coming down here with a trail, and I've got a cliff face over here. So if a deer anywhere within a quarter mile of here is going to go down to this canyon, he's going to do it right here. Now, granted, this is a very extreme example of a microfunnel, but it doesn't take nearly this type of thing to guide animal movement in the woods. It could be something as seemingly insignificant as a branch laying on the ground, or a downed tree, or the brush is heavier over here than it is over here. All of these things will come into play when you're tracking wounded animals, so don't disregard them.
When faced with multiple options, I'll start with the most likely and systematically investigate each and every one until I find some kind of sign that is going to confirm that I'm on the right track.
Turkey shite. So another hugely important factor to look at is the arrangement of vegetation. So you can see I just walked through this little area here, and if you look at the grass, you'll see that I completely changed the orientation of the grass. So most of that grass was pointed downhill. Where I just walked through, the grass is pointed in the direction of travel.
When you first start looking at this type of sign, it's probably going to be very difficult for you to distinguish between an animal's disturbance and anything else. One great way to learn to interpret these types of signs is to find an area and really study the vegetation, then walk through the area and study it again and see how things have changed. Or watch your buddy walk through an area, or perhaps your dog, and see what type of disturbance they left behind them.
So another great example of how to use vegetation arrangement to determine which way an animal went is to look at how the brush or grass or whatever you're traveling through lays against one another. And so if you find yourself in a situation like this where there's a lot of brush, or maybe it's fir boughs or whatever you happen to be tracking through, if you've got vegetation that's coming in contact with one another, and an animal moves through that, they're going to push that brush ahead of them. And the brush is going to open up, and when they pass, it's going to spring back. And oftentimes, when it springs back, it'll tint against itself or catch against itself, and it'll be pointing in the direction of travel. And if you look at this situation that's right here behind me, I've got a little branch that's coming down right here, and it's on this side of this brush that's over here to the side of it. And I want you to watch what that brush does, or what this branch does, when I walk through there. And so what you can see is that this brush now, instead of being on that side of this brush here, It's now tinted against this side of this brush. So when I walk through there, it pulled this branch this way, sprung back, and now it's sitting on this side. Now, this is a pretty big example. When I walk back through there, it's gonna do the same thing. So now that's a pretty big branch, and oftentimes you're not gonna be looking for something that big. I just used that as an example because it's easy to see on camera. These things can be tiny. I mean, we're talking about one blade of grass that got pushed on the other side of a blade of grass. It can be, sometimes it can be the most seemingly inconsequential little teeny tiny detail that'll break the case wide open and lead you to an animal.
Once you've developed an eye for this type of sign, you're going to be seeing it everywhere you look.
And so this video isn't really aimed at being like a comprehensive tracking and trailing video. I wanted to just throw some things out there, get you to thinking about some of the other things that you could be looking for besides just blood or obvious tracks. There are many other forms of sign that the animal leaves when they pass through. So if you learn to look for some of these things, I think you're going to have a whole lot more success in your trailing. So these things that I've talked about are just a couple of the signs that you can look at, and these things are going to indicate the passage of any animal. Doesn't matter if it's the one you shot or not. And so you're never going to stop looking for blood or hair or anything else that might indicate the animal that you shot. And oftentimes I'm using these little cues, the vegetation arrangement, a scuff mark, the way the landscape lays, as guides. And then I'm looking for something, anything, a piece of hair or a speck of blood on the underside of a leaf perhaps, to confirm that I'm on that right trail. We owe it to the animals to do everything in our power to try to find them once we've shot them. And I think developing your tracking skills is just as important as going to the range and shooting your rifle or your bow or whatever you're hunting with. So get out there and get it done.